President Johnson insisted that the Tet Offensive had been a devastating defeat for the communists. Militarily, he was right. The basic assumptions on which the North Vietnamese mounted their offensive had all proved to be wrong. Hanoi's leaders had assumed the ARVN would crumble, that South Vietnamese soldiers would come over to their side. Instead, not a single unit defected. The civilian populace Hanoi expected to rise up may have been unhappy with their government, but they had little sympathy for communism. And when the fighting began, they had hidden in their homes to escape the fury in the streets.
Được báo cáo như thế nào mà nó là khi mà cộng sản vô thì người dân sẽ nổi dậy. Cái chuyện đó tôi nghĩ là họ đã sai lầm trầm trọng.
North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap, who had opposed the offensive from the beginning, later remembered that Tet had been a costly lesson, paid for in blood and bone.
Đã từng có những cái sĩ quan cao cấp của quân đội Việt Nam, quân đội nhân dân Việt Nam ra đầu hàng. Đó là một cái chuyện mà chưa bao giờ xảy ra. Tất cả các đơn vị, không còn một cái đơn vị nào còn nguyên cả, có những cái đại đội. Nếu còn phiên hiệu thì cũng chỉ còn vài ba người.
Of the 84,000 enemy troops who are estimated to have taken part in the Tet Offensive, more than half, as many as 58,000 men and women, most of them Viet Cong, are thought to have been killed or wounded or captured.
The American military command celebrated the Tet Offensive as a victory. You know, they finally came at us and we blew them away, which was basically true. But the administration had been telling the American public for most of the end of 67 and for the first month of 1968 that the war was being won. That the NLF and the North Vietnamese were ground down to such an extent that we could see the end of the war, a victory.
The Tet Offensive has forced our generals to reevaluate their...
So when Tet hit, it contradicted everything that the administration and the Saigon country team had been telling the American public through its journalists for the previous 4 or 5 months.
John Lawrence, CBS News, Saigon.
It broke the will of the United States to fight that war. It was such a shock that it stripped away the last vestiges of the fiction and fanciful interpretations that had led us down this primrose path into disaster. After that, nobody could be convinced.
And then the most ferocious possible argument erupted inside the U.S. government, because the hawks on the war were saying Tet was North Vietnam's last gasp. It was their last shot at winning the war, and they failed. We beat them, and that's the end of them. And we said, after all these years of war, if that's what they are able to do, we ought to learn some lesson about their commitment to this war as well, and the cost to us.
On March 10th, the New York Times reported that the Army was requesting 206,000 additional troops for Vietnam. But if the United States had been winning the war, many Americans asked, if Tet had in fact been a disaster for the enemy, why were still more men needed? More and more members of the president's own party now felt free to express their doubts. Our enemy has finally shattered the mask of official illusion, Senator Robert Kennedy said. Unable to defeat him or break his will, we must actively seek a peaceful settlement. Walter Cronkite, the respected anchor of the CBS Evening News, had come home from covering the Tet Offensive, convinced victory was no longer possible.
We have been too often disappointed by the optimism of the American leaders, both in Vietnam and Washington, to have faith any longer in the silver linings they find in the darkest clouds. To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.